There is a word that does not appear on most airline websites serving Taiwan. It is not a technical term. It is not an aviation term. It is simply a name, Taiwan. On the website of Lufthansa, it does not appear as Taiwan. British Airways does not list it as Taiwan. Air India does not call it Taiwan. They call it Taipei, China, or Taiwan, China, or some simply list the airport code and nothing more. Not because those airlines had a conversation about geopolitics. Not because their lawyers sat down and weighed the political implications of naming a destination. They did it because a government that does not operate any of those airlines, in a country that most of those airlines barely fly to, sent them letters and told them to change it, and every single one of them complied. That is one half of what this video is about. It is about how Beijing has already turned commercial aviation into a political instrument, quietly, over decades, without firing a single shot, without closing a single route, and without doing anything that most passengers would ever notice when they sit down and open a booking page. The other half is about what happens to the sky itself. Because while the branding story is quiet and invisible to the passenger, the physical version of it is not. The Taipei Flight Information Region is one of the most important blocks of airspace in the world. And it can be restricted with 1 day's notice in a way that affects over 100,000 passengers simultaneously. That happened just a few months ago. And the global aviation industry responded, in effect, by absorbing the disruption and moving on. These two stories are the same story. They share the same logic, the same leverage, and the same absence of any coherent international response. And understanding how they connect tells you something critical about where the pressure is heading and why the aviation industry's current posture may not survive the next escalation intact. Start at the beginning, because the history here is richer than most people realize, and it explains why the branding episode of recent years was not a new idea, but rather a continuation of something that has been running in commercial aviation for half a century. The political split between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China on Taiwan dates to 1949, when the communist forces under Mao Zedong won the Civil War and the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek retreated with roughly 2 million people to the island of Taiwan, around 130 kilometers off the Chinese coast. From that moment, two governments claimed to represent the legitimate Chinese state. And from quite early on, that dispute worked its way into commercial aviation. The first airline to feel it was Japan Airlines. Japan normalized diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1972. Beijing's condition was that Japan must recognize the One China principle, which meant no official state activities that implied Taiwan was a separate country. Japan Airlines flew to Taiwan, but Beijing made clear that they could not fly to both mainland China and Taiwan under the Japan Airlines brand. The economic consequences for Japan Airlines of losing mainland China were significant enough that the airline needed a solution. And Beijing, interestingly, offered one, a face-saving mechanism that would allow both sides to maintain their positions without a direct collision. The answer was a subsidiary. In 1975, Japan Asia Airways was created, a wholly owned subsidiary of Japan Airlines, registered separately and operating flights to Taiwan under its own brand. Japan Airlines, the parent company, flew to mainland China. Japan Asia Airways flew to Taipei. As far as Beijing was concerned, Japan Airlines was not flying to Taiwan. A different airline was. The fiction was transparent, but it was politically functional. Japan Asia Airways operated Japan-Taiwan services for over 3 decades, using a range of aircraft, including Douglas DC-10s, Boeing 747s, and Boeing 767s, before finally shutting down in 2008, when the restrictions between Taiwan and mainland China were loosened enough that a separate entity was no longer necessary. Once that template existed, other airlines began using it as their own exposure to both markets grew. In 1990, Qantas created Australia Asia Airlines, using Boeing 747 SPs, the 14.73 meter shorter version of the regular 747, and a Boeing 767, flying between Australia and Taipei. The flying kangaroo on the tail was replaced with a wave design to remove the national symbol. Qantas was eventually privatized, which removed its status as an official state carrier. And once it was no longer government-owned, the political argument for a separate entity weakened. Australia Asia Airlines was wound up in 1996. Then in 1993, British Airways created British Asia Airways. The name was painted on modified aircraft in a variation of the British Airways livery of the time, with Chinese characters for British Asia on the tail. It operated flights from London Heathrow to Taipei via Hong Kong, using Boeing 747s 5 years, until 1998, when British Airways decided the Taipei route itself was no longer commercially justifiable and ceased operations entirely. In 1995, 3 carriers launched subsidiaries almost simultaneously. KLM created KLM Asia, registered in Taiwan, to fly between Amsterdam, Schiphol, and Taipei, initially via Bangkok, using Boeing 747-400s. The modification to the aircraft was specific and deliberate. The Dutch crown logo was removed from the tail and replaced with the KLM Asia wordmark. The Dutch national flag was removed. The European Union flag was removed. The aircraft were stripped of every symbol that connected them to the Dutch state, because that was the entire point. In Beijing's framing, KLM, the Dutch national carrier, was not flying to Taiwan. KLM Asia, a separately registered Taiwanese entity, was. The fiction was maintained, the routes ran, and, crucially, the mainline KLM aircraft continued serving Beijing and Shanghai without any problem. In the same year, Swissair created Swissair Asia, operating twice-weekly services between Zurich and Taipei via Bangkok, using McDonnell Douglas MD-11 aircraft. The Swiss cross on the tail, one of the most recognizable national symbols in European aviation, was replaced with a Chinese character for Switzerland. Not the cross, not the Swiss flag. A single character chosen specifically because it carried no national insignia that Beijing could object to. Air France followed in 1998 with Air France ASI, using Airbus A340-200s and Boeing 747-400s, flying Paris Charles de Gaulle to Taipei via Hong Kong. The French tricolor on the tail was replaced with a blue and white version that stripped out the red stripe, the color most associated with the French flag, to avoid any connection to the French state. Lufthansa took a different approach entirely. Rather than create an Asia subsidiary, Lufthansa used its leisure subsidiary, Condor, operating a Boeing 747-400 under the Condor brand name for its Taiwan flights. The logic was exactly the same. Lufthansa, the German flag carrier, was not flying to Taiwan, but a different airline under a different brand happened to be. Think about what this collection of corporate restructuring represents. Every major European aviation power, and 2 of the world's most prominent Asian Pacific carriers, chose to create fake airlines, modify their liveries, remove national symbols, and register entities in Taiwan rather than push back against Beijing's political demands. Each individual decision was commercially rational. Each airline looked at the size of the Chinese market versus the size of the Taiwan market and made the obvious calculation. And the cumulative result was that Beijing's position, that Taiwan is not a separate country, and that airlines flying there as national carriers are therefore making an implicit political statement in its favor, became the operating assumption of the global aviation industry, without any formal treaty, without any ICAO ruling, without any international mechanism at all. Before I continue, here is something that surprises me every time I check my analytics. More than 90% of the people watching this video is not subscribed. And when I look at a story like this one, that is genuinely puzzling to me. Because what happened with these Asia subsidiaries is not something you find explained in depth anywhere in mainstream aviation coverage. The KLM Asia branding still flies today. 9 Boeing 777s in the KLM fleet still carry that KLM Asia wordmark, still without the Dutch crown, still without the Dutch flag. Decades later, the entity KLM created to navigate a geopolitical problem in the 1990s is still operating, because the geopolitical problem it was created to navigate has not gone away, it has intensified. And if you want to keep following this story as it develops, subscribe and hit the bell, and also send this to one person who is totally into aviation and needs to hear about this. Okay, now back to where we were. So because those subsidiaries represent the first generation of Beijing's influence over global airline behavior, the second generation arrived in 2018, and it was far more direct. In April of that year, China's Civil Aviation Administration, the CAAC, sent letters to 44 international airlines. The demand was that those airlines change how they refer to Taiwan on their websites and booking systems. Listing Taiwan as a separate country, or even as simply Taiwan without a qualifier connecting it to China, was declared a violation of the One China policy. Airlines were told to use phrasing such as Taiwan China or China Taiwan region, making explicit that Taiwan was, in Beijing's view, a province rather than a separate political entity. The deadline was July of that year. 40 of the 44 airlines complied fully. British Airways, Lufthansa, Air Canada, Air India, and dozens of others used the labeling Beijing requested directly. The 4 that did not meet the deadline were United Airlines, American Airlines, Delta Airlines, and Hawaiian Airlines. The White House called the directive Orwellian nonsense and publicly expressed dismay at the industry's compliance. But within weeks, all 4 US carriers had also adjusted their websites, using a workaround of listing only airport codes without any country designation, rather than the explicit Taiwan-China phrasing. The effect was the same. Taiwan disappeared from their booking platforms as a named destination. The leverage was identical to the leverage that had produced the Asia subsidiaries 30 years earlier. The Chinese aviation market is the second largest in the world. Any airline that flies to the mainland, or wants to, is exposed. The CAAC had made clear that non-compliant airlines risked having their websites blocked in China and losing market access entirely. When the alternative is losing access to hundreds of millions of potential passengers, the calculation is not really about geopolitical principle. It is about survival. And so the entire industry complied, a second time, in a second generation of the same political pressure. What Beijing achieved in 2018 was not just a labeling change. It established a precedent that its political position on Taiwan's status can be enforced across global aviation infrastructure, including on airlines that have no flights to or from China at all, simply because the threat of market exclusion is credible enough to produce compliance industry-wide. Now, the third layer, the physical one. And this is where the story moves from branding and websites into actual airspace and actual disruption. The Taipei Flight Information Region, which Taiwan's Civil Aviation Administration is responsible for managing, sits directly across some of the busiest corridors in the Asia-Pacific network. Flights from Southeast Asia to North Asia, from East Asia to North America, from Australia toward Japan and Korea, all route through or near this airspace. It is not peripheral. It is central to the daily operation of dozens of airlines that have no connection to Taiwanese politics whatsoever. On the 30th of December last year, China's People's Liberation Army launched an exercise called Justice Mission 2025. It designated 7 maritime and airspace zones around Taiwan and announced live fire exercises running from 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening. The notice came one day before the exercise began. International Civil Aviation Organization regulations require a minimum of 7 days advance notice for exercises affecting civil aviation, along with prior coordination with the affected flight information region. China issued its notice to Taiwan's Civil Aviation Administration through a CAAC bulletin with approximately 24 hours warning and no prior coordination. Taiwan's Transport Ministry condemned this as a serious violation of international norms and aviation practices. The response from the international community was largely silence. 11 of the 14 international air routes through the Taipei Flight Information Region became unusable during the exercise window. Taiwan's Civil Aviation Administration estimated that over 850 flights were affected, 296 outbound, 265 inbound, 296 in transit, over 100,000 international passengers disrupted in a single day. An additional 84 domestic flights were canceled, affecting around 6,000 passengers on routes to the outlying islands of Kinmen and Matsu, which have no surface connection to Taiwan proper and depend entirely on air links. Taiwan's air traffic controllers activated flow control measures and coordinated with adjacent flight information regions in Fukuoka, Hong Kong, and Manila to guide aircraft around restricted zones. Airlines were instructed to ensure aircraft carried additional fuel before departure to allow for rerouting. The congestion cascaded through the following day. This was not a minor weather event. This was the deliberate restriction of a major international air corridor with 1 day's notice, creating knock-on delays for airlines and passengers across East Asia who had nothing to do with Taiwanese politics. And it was not the first exercise of its kind. Earlier in 2025, China had conducted exercises named Straight Thunder 2025A, with the Shandong Carrier Strike Group participating in that one. In the first 9 months of 2025 alone, Taiwan logged over 4,000 Chinese military aircraft incursions into its air defense identification zone. Drone incursions occurred at least 8 times in those months. The pattern is normalization. China is training its forces to operate around Taiwan at sustained volume and tempo. And the byproduct of that training is the periodic disruption of civilian airspace that the industry currently has no mechanism to anticipate, negotiate, or formally challenge. There is a structural problem underneath all of this that makes it uniquely difficult for aviation to manage. The Taipei Flight Information Region is under Taiwan's administrative control. China does not recognize Taiwan as a legitimate governing authority. China's own civil aviation systems have no formal bilateral coordination channel with Taipei. When China designates temporary airspace restrictions, it does not notify Taiwan's Civil Aviation Administration through any agreed mechanism, because in Beijing's framework, no such mechanism should exist. The 24-hour CAAC bulletin that preceded Justice Mission 2025 is not a protocol. It is an improvised workaround in a governance vacuum, operating across some of the world's busiest flight corridors. Now connect this back to where the story started. The Asia subsidiaries of the 1990s show that Beijing could reshape the structure of international airlines, including how they register their entities and what national symbols appear on their aircraft. Using market access as leverage, the branding compliance of 2018 showed that the same leverage could reshape how airlines present political geography to passengers across the entire global internet. And Justice Mission 2025 showed that the physical airspace can be restricted at scale with essentially no advance notice, producing mass disruption and generating no durable international consequence. 3 different instruments, 3 different generations. Same underlying logic. Aviation is a domain where political and military pressure produces compliance because the industry's exposure to China is large enough and the international governance structures fragmented enough that effective collective resistance does not materialize. What makes this particularly striking today is where Taiwan's aviation sector itself currently stands. China Airlines, whose name carries the branding contradiction at maximum intensity, still exists under a name that passengers globally assume belongs to a mainland Chinese carrier. Its parliament has debated a rename for years without agreeing on one that would not further provoke Beijing. The airline is simultaneously in a period of significant expansion, with Boeing 787 Dreamliners beginning deliveries in 2026 to replace its aging Airbus A330 fleet, Airbus A350-900s already operating, and orders in place for A350-1000s and Boeing 777-9 for later in the decade. EVA Air recently added a Taipei to Dallas-Fort Worth service. Starlux, the premium Taiwanese startup that launched just a few years ago into one of the world's most competitive markets, continues expanding internationally. And China Airlines has just agreed a code share with KLM, ironically, that will make Helsinki a new European destination. Taiwan's aviation sector is more ambitious and better capitalized than it has been in a generation. All of that investment, all of those new aircraft, all of those new routes sit under an airspace that can be meaningfully disrupted with 1 day's notice and no formal coordination. The airlines expanding into Taiwan are doing so against a geopolitical backdrop that is moving in one clear direction. More frequent exercises, more drones, more incremental normalization of Chinese military presence in the airspace around Taiwan. The honest conclusion, sitting at the end of all of this, is that global aviation is operating in the Taiwan Strait on an assumption of stability that the evidence from 2025 increasingly challenges. The Asia subsidiaries showed the industry would restructure itself to satisfy Beijing's political demands. The 2018 compliance showed the industry would change how it presents reality on its own platforms. Justice Mission 2025 showed the physical airspace is interruptible at scale without triggering any durable response. KLM still flies to Taipei as KLM Asia, crown removed, flag removed, because the corporate structure built in 1995 to manage a political problem is still relevant in 2026. That is not a historical footnote. That is a live signal about where this is going. The next disruption of the Taipei flight information region will come. Airlines will reroute and absorb the delays and return to normal operations. The question is whether the duration and scope of future exercises eventually forces a conversation the industry is currently not having about contingency routing, about what a sustained restriction rather than a 10-hour exercise actually means for the Asia-Pacific network, and about whether the governance vacuum around the Taipei flight information region is something that ICAO and its member states are willing to address, or whether they too will absorb each incident and move on because the geopolitical exposure to China makes a different response too costly. If this gave you a clearer picture of a story most aviation coverage treats as a footnote, hit the like button and subscribe if you are not already. And I want your view in the comments looking at everything: the subsidiaries, the branding compliance, the airspace disruptions. Do you think the global aviation industry has already accepted that Beijing's political position on Taiwan shapes how airlines operate? Or is there a version of this story where the industry finds a way to push back? Leave your answer below. I read all of them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.